Welcome everyone to our latest edition of CharitEpulse. This week we will be talking about a number of different stories and issues attracting our attention really across the group. My name is Catherine Rastomji. I head the charities practice at Shakespeare Martineau. I'm joined today by my regular compadres. So I have Charles Mosquita from Quilter Cheviot and James Saunders from Moore Kingston Smith. So I'm diving straight in with a story that's been rumbling for a bit of time about the Actors Benevolent Fund, which does sound as though if you're going to do a dispute, you shouldn't involve actors, because this has really taken hold, I think, of that charity. But the Charity Commission has officially closed its compliance case, but it has cited examples for the whole sector that says, that you really shouldn't allow disagreements to overshadow your charity's positive work. So I suppose the regulator there trying to give that wider learning piece across the sector for all charities. But I did wonder your thoughts and experiences of charity disputes, but also around how boards of trustees are appointed, reappointed, refreshed, all of those sorts of issues. Charles? James? Oh, James, you blinked first, so you get
I did blink. I mean, I actually was going to draw on a bit of personal experience. I mean, as auditors, we tend to not get too involved in disputes, certainly perhaps as much as lawyers might. But I do remember one case from a few years ago where there was a very difficult situation with, similar to the Actors Benevolent, I think, is a couple of tribes, if you like, of trustees disagreeing quite vehemently. As I was asked to get involved on various elements, really, to do with, governance, if you like, just trying to make sure that things were, the disagreement was run or was managed carefully and professionally. And actually, in that case, in the end, it did work out reasonably well, and everyone got to an amicable result. The key was they were professional and civilized and respected the processes they had in place, which in the end proved to be adequate. So they did have the right processes to manage disputes in place. And that's probably one of the key learning points from any of these sort of situations. Make sure you got the right process in place in the first place to deal with these sort of disputes. Do you know, for example, what would happen if two of your trustees or two groups of your trustees did find themselves at odds over it? At what point do you need to bring in any sort of dispute resolution mechanism? Because if you're a management team, for example, and your trustees do start to argue, you could feel a little bit like either it's not your problem, that's for them to sort out. Of course, it actually is your problem, absolutely, because it's the running of the charity one way or another. Do you know exactly, what's the trigger point? What might be a number of trigger points? Where do you go? Who is responsible for enacting what comes after those trigger points? Is it the CEO? How much authority do they have? And trustees themselves, of course, have got to recognise that this could put everyone in a very difficult situation if they do have these sort of running disagreements. So it's very much the first point is get your mechanisms in place, know what happens. Do a few case studies or, modeling, just know what you're supposed to do.
I have to say, thankfully, I've had very little personal experience of this sort of situation. I suppose the bits that struck me, one is it's quite difficult to know exactly what went on. It's interesting that there was a comment yesterday in the press from one of the obviously disgruntled trustees about dissatisfaction with the Charity Commission and taking it to the Parliamentary Ombudsman, which I think is deeply depressing. That's not a great way for regulation, that every time anything happens and somebody's unhappy with the decision. It does appear that the Charity Commission have acknowledged that they didn't consult all the trustees widely enough in the first instance. It would appear that some of the trustees that were no longer trustees hadn't been engaged with, so they've acknowledged that. From my experience of listening to other people, the areas that it really comes a cropper is when you have trustees that are either elected or coming from other organizations, and I suppose you end up with the wrong mix on the board. And the final thing I sort of thought about was the importance of the chair. But at the end of the day, if your sole focus is on your beneficiaries, you should be able to come to an amicable conclusion of what the right outcome is, even if you have to accept that that's not necessarily your view on the particular subject. So yeah, people have to get their egos out of the way and focus on what they're meant to be doing.
Yeah, I thought that overall message from the Charity Commission was it in a nutshell, wasn't it? That they've completely forgotten what their charity was actually there to do, rather than just continue this dispute internally. Another point I noticed, we covered it on our last Charity Pulse, was around the consultation concerning possible changes to the Charity Governance Code. And the one that seems to have got people the most excited is whether there should be a charge for using the Charity Governance Code, and also generally whether the review is a good thing, we need it, we don't need it, who knows. Charles, any thoughts on comments you've seen this week?
Yeah, I mean, we made the comment, didn't we, that we didn't think charities should pay for it, and that it's, otherwise you might as well pay for the Charity Commission or Oscar, or for the Charity Commission in Northern Ireland. So I think you either pay for all regulation or you pay for no regulation. I think the charity sector, I think there is a very strong case of why they shouldn't pay, and that should be funded. I feel deeply uncomfortable about them having to go and find funding from sponsors, because I think you could end up with the wrong people doing it and influence becoming corrupt. I'm not, in the way of, I suppose, American politics, but, I think one has to be mindful of that. Yes, we covered the review last time. It's interesting they should focus on that, and I think that the response is probably the right one.
Yeah, it's interesting, is it? James, your hot topics. It has been a week for you. There were two things that caught my eye and immediately made me think, must ask James about those. There is the world's first international accounting standards draft that has been put out for charities to comment on, which I know is something we have talked about before. But before you give us your thoughts on that, also saw that this man must now surely be your patron saint, who has written an article to say, let's have 3 cheers for the charity sector's auditors. And as you know, Charles and I are always giving you 3 cheers. But your comments on either or both of those particular.
The article that I actually shared with you, because it did, of course, catch my eye, but it did talk about the value, and this is the kind of always the point with auditors. It can often be seen as a tick box exercise. Just get the audit done. We have to do it because we're a certain size. Get them in, get them out, and get the signatures on the box. That is, I would say this is completely the wrong way of looking at it. Your auditor can be very knowledgeable about you, your operations, your activities, and about other organizations that that work in your sector, that do similar organizations, commercial, non-profit, everything. I've had a 20-odd year career, and I've seen most of the sort of the types of charities that work, schools, academies. I've seen a bit of everything, really. And that experience is invaluable to draw on from a client, an audited entity these days, not allowed to call them clients. But draw on that experience. That is the real key. And I think that article was saying, was moving into this sort of area. Don't just look at it as a compliance area. Just tap into them as much as you can. There is 2 levels of it. There's the ad hoc advice. What do you think about this? Have you seen this? I've got more and more clients asking these last year or two about what do you think about introducing bonus schemes, for example? Do you see anyone, those sort of slightly off the wall concepts? Have you seen this anywhere else? Have you got any other clients doing this sort of thing? What's the norm? That sort of insight you can get from your auditors. The additional services, tax and those sort of things, okay, they're going to be paid for. Of course, you're going to look at your auditors for those sort of things, but the real key is tap into those insights and that knowledge, because there's a wealth back there. Our teams go and audit different organizations, charities, but they audit different ones every week. They go to a client, audit them, come back. They will have enormous amounts of insight into what works, what doesn't, different accounting systems, the way you account for journals, the way you do your stock provisions, bad debt, all these sort of things. And they see it every single day, and they'll see what does work and doesn't. Tap into that as much as you can, because all of our teams have got loads of experience.
But James, isn't this the same with all professional advisors? I think he's made a really good point. Is we seem to have changed over the last 20 to 30 years from being over trusting to now being suspicious of everybody. And what I sort of sense is people aren't necessarily particularly good, or they don't really understand, of being discerning about those that really do have the experience, the knowledge, and that sort of wealth to be able to share, to those that aren't. I mean, Catherine will see it in the legal profession of people who are, I'll describe them politely as GPs, to somebody doing being a charity specialist. Go to a charity specialist, the advice you're going to get is absolutely built on a huge wealth of information.
There's also, Charles, there's also a second element, which is, and this is, we've talked about this before, with particularly tendering for new services, whether that's audit or otherwise. When you talk to people who and you've got 3 or 4 different firms, whatever they are, tendering for your work, talk to them and find out who's keen, who's interested, who actually wants to work with you, and importantly, who you do trust. Now, we've said before, you're not going to get that from a lot of the procurement processes that are in place at the moment, and people are moving away from those tick box, fill in a form procurement processes for this very reason, I think. Or the good one, the sensible ones are, because you need to be able to talk to and get advice from, as much as you can from those appointments you make. And you're only going to be doing that if you can trust them. I mean, dare I say, like them as people. That's going to make a huge difference. I know that the ethical standard for auditors would take all of that out, but in reality, a good working relationship is so important and will give you so much more than, frankly, saving £500 on an audit fee, for example. That's the big trick.
But this goes back to the governance code, isn't it? Which I think, having a governance code set of principles really good, but then people use it which ends up you saying, well, you must go out to review every 3, 5 or whatever. That's not what the law says. The law says you've got to keep people under review to make sure that they're doing a good job for you. If they're doing a good job for you, then you might want to test the price occasionally. Just keep going with them because they have all that knowledge and everything else. I just think we have gone a little bit too far the other way.
Yeah, there's got to be a balance on professionalism and relationship. They aren't mutually exclusive. They can go hand in hand as long as everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. And that added value piece, I think, is where true professionals show their worth, to say, well, we've seen this, we can give you comparisons, we can talk on the hoof, rather than one client described it to me as some people are 1 page ahead in the textbook. Is not that great. That's not knowledge. That's not, interpreting it.
Yeah, quite. The other point then, Catherine, was about the international standard, and it's the first international standard for non-profit accounting, if you like, which we talked about. I think we probably talked about it. I think I raised it about a year ago. We did it in one of these sessions. And finally, there's some consultation gone. I mean, the big point really is how slowly these things work. It's taken a year to get to this point. We know, I mean, we're a year closer, if you like, in time, but what's happened in the meantime? There's been some consultation, people have thought about it a bit, and finally some insight is being drawn, but it's still obviously not on nowhere near the statute books, let's put it that way.
Yeah. And I think that consultation, you could ask me every question in it. I'm not sure I would know an answer to anyway. I think, well, I don't know. But Charles, I'm coming to you now in terms of use of charitable assets, I suppose, would be the overall theme. I'd seen 2 articles this week, one about a charity rebranding. I suppose are we just cynical, where you scroll to the bottom of the article to see how much did they spend on the rebrand, and do we think that was worth it compared to the logo that then appears? So this one happens to be Hospice UK, that has spent £90,000 on a rebrand. Seems to me it's a circle of H's and it's orange. There seems to be methodology and meaning behind those letters and that colour, but for 90,000, I don't know if I was expecting more. And the other article, and maybe it's linked to this in a way, is charities leave £3 billion languishing in cash. And I suppose overall, Charles, just talking about what charities should be doing with their resources, what's good management, what isn't.
Yeah, I mean, the branding issue, I mean, we see it time and time again, and you do also, well, yeah, you're right. You always look at what the price they've spent on it to whether there's a value, and it's very difficult to tell. I have to say, I couldn't remember what the branding was before with that particular one. There were 4, I think, organizations that have branded recently. Breakthrough TID. Do you know who TID is?
No.
No. Well, there we are. That's good branding for you.
Okay.
And then there was one All Child, and then the Royal Opera and Ballet. And actually, the Royal Opera and Ballet is interesting. They didn't tell a price of what they'd spent, but what they did acknowledge is that it was called the Royal Opera House, but nobody knew they did ballet. So actually, in that instance, it sort of made complete sense. I think these things are very difficult, but you do have to be very careful they don't turn into vanity projects and people are just being bored and just got bored of the branding. So yeah, very difficult, but you do have to question whether it's value for money. The 3 billion, again, I think that's I think one needs to be very careful about headlines. There was a particular purpose of this organization wanting to I suppose have a bit of clickbait in getting people's attention. I mean, there is definitely an opportunity, and there's been a big difference where you've had interest rates going from 0.5% to 5.25%, and suddenly cash. And there are a lot of charities that do sit on cash. Need to have a look at what their banks are paying, and if they're not paying a reasonable rate, they should really look. And there are lots of options out there. You know, there's cash management platforms, you've got money market funds, and you've got corporate bonds. Depending on what you do, you need to segment it from a time frame basis and look at when you're going to need this cash and everything else. But yes, I think trustees should definitely be questioning the opportunity loss if they're not proactive on the treasury management, where 3 or 4 years ago it didn't make a difference, and for 15 years prior to that it didn't really make much of an impact, and there was very little option. So I think they're right to raise it. I think from my experience, charities are doing more than that article certainly was indicating.
Yeah, but it did work, I suppose, as clickbait. It did make me look at it and you think languishing, yeah. Good word, but yes, I thought
so in that respect, it's done good news. So that where you're a trustee, Catherine, you'll be going back to your finance director or who's ever in charge and saying, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Catherine, can I just go back to the point of the marketing spend?
Yeah.
And I mean, as an accountant, with an accountant, all good accountants would say this. One of the ways to assess is to look at return on investment and have some sort of assessment of how successful that spend has been. And like with all things budgetary, set what you think what are the objectives of the rebrand in the first place. If you're just rebranding for rebrand's sake, you just don't like the logo, or let's modernize, that'll make all the difference. That's no way to start the project. Obviously, the real trick is to say, right, what do we want from it? How do we assess success or otherwise? So you can certainly on a financial side, the return on investment is it going to generate more links, more clicks, if you like? Is it going to generate more income somehow through whatever means? Then on the more sort of touchy-feely side, is it going to make people's feelings about our organisation different, better, hopefully, or whatever you want to get from it? As Charles said, if you want to raise awareness of ballet along with the Opera House, fine. Then how do you judge it? Give it then 3, 6, 9, 12 months, however long, and start judging it. How well has that money been spent? How effective has it against your original objective? So, I mean, that will be the real key, wouldn't it? So well and good to the articles saying they've spent this much to do this. Actually, they've spent this much to do what? To get what objective out of it?
I think the problem is, James, is that a lot of these, it's difficult to actually measure that. And secondly,
well, our impact assessment team would say otherwise. They would say there's always a way to measure impact, especially in the non-profit charity world. You can always find some way of working out whether something's been successful or not. And indeed, our sort of the corporate financiers would always say you can always assess that return on investment somehow. You just got to set the objectives right.
Well, because I think companies are also equally culpable to this little vanity issue. I think a lot of the time you get change and the value is not ever demonstrated. And the problem is whoever's put that change in is never going to admit to it. So I accept what you say, but again, looking at it, there are occasions where you go, wow, that was a really clever move. But I can't say that happens that often. And also, if you've got a title where people don't know what the name actually is or what the activity of the organization, I think that to me is a pretty good starting point. But maybe this particular organization isn't targeting the general public, doesn't worry about fundraising.
Yeah, I don't think they are actually. So yeah, it'd be interesting, won't it? And I suppose what others think of it, but it does lead me both, as you talk about evaluating and what people think and, getting some feedback. As Terry Wogan used to say, it would be lovely to hear from our dear listener. So if you do have comments on these sessions, any feedback, we'd love to hear it. Also, I think Charles and I would love if you find an article that says how to love your charities investment manager or love your charities solicitor. Please share those with us and we will wax lyrical on our next session. We'd love that. But yeah, do follow along, whether this is the podcast or the recording, to be able to share, give us any comments that you think of that occur to you. We would love to hear from you. And we look forward to seeing you on the next session. Thank you.